This is Find Your Dream Job, the podcast that helps you get hired, have the career you want, and make a difference in life. I'm your host, Mac Pritchard. I'm also the founder of Mac's List. It's a job board in the Pacific Northwest that helps you find a fulfilling career. Every Wednesday, I talk to a different expert about the tools you need to get the work you want. Find Your Dream Job is brought to you by Top Resume. Top Resume has helped more than 400,000 professionals land more interviews and get hired faster. Get a free review of your resume today. Go to maxlist.org/topresume. You can have widely different experiences when you apply for a job, but you don't have to accept poor treatment. Kevin Grossman is here to talk about what you should expect from an employer as a candidate. He's the president of the Talent Board. It's a nonprofit group that promotes the job candidate experience with benchmarks for accountability, fairness, and business results. Kevin joins us from Santa Cruz, California. Well, let's get right into it, Kevin. How typical is it for candidates to have a bad experience when applying for a job?
Mac, I wish I could say not that prevalent, but that's unfortunately not the case. We've been measuring candidate experience for over 11 years now. And while there are companies that have made significant improvement over the years in our community, it is unfortunately still a very non-communicative, potentially dark process for many candidates.
What are common examples, Kevin, of poor treatment of candidates by employers?
Well, first and foremost, it's just all about lack of definitive response, meaning if I am an interested candidate for a particular job at any company, big and small across industries, and I actually apply for that job, what is it that happens next? For most candidates, it is a very oblique, ambiguous autoresponder that goes out to the candidate saying, thanks very much for your application. If you are qualified, we'll be in touch. Now that's something. A couple of problems with that is that it is again, not very personable. It's not very positive. And these days it's much harder to deliver emails and get folks to actually see those emails. I mean, everything from spam filters, to email compliance issues. I mean, the list goes on, and there are many more candidates that, for whatever reason, just aren't even seeing the emails, even if they go out. So that's the usual experience for most job candidates when they apply.
At this stage, Kevin, are there employers who still don't send out emails at all? I see the point you're making about spam filters, but are there companies that don't even bother to acknowledge applications?
The good news is that I have not talked recently in the past few years with any organizations that actually definitively say they don't send out even acknowledgement emails, is what they're also called when somebody applies. I do remember a few years ago, this is pre-pandemic, where there were multiple companies that I had spoken with that the recruiting leadership felt like it's not a very good experience to send them that autoresponder, which of course some would argue, including me, that's probably the case. But then they decided that they were only going to respond to those that were actually going to be screened. So the qualified candidates that were going to make it to the next stages. And I immediately, my response was not a good idea, because it is one thing to get an automated email that says, we're not going to pursue you, but thanks for your time, which is unfortunately the reality for the sheer majority of job candidates today that are applying for jobs. Again, mostly, especially bigger size, mid-sized global enterprise companies, but to not send anything at all is, I would argue, is always a mistake. And so yes, it can be kind of a double-edged sword, but I haven't run into companies lately that are not sending things out. I think for the most part, it's for any company, even small companies that have an applicant tracking system, there is a message that goes out.
So check your spam filter if you haven't heard
Yep.
back. What
Yep.
are other examples of poor treatment of candidates by employers, Kevin?
Well, one of the things, we all have had these experiences and even myself as a job seeker. I mean, we remember the good and the bad. Unfortunately, the bad can be the most visceral, emotional memories that we have sometimes when we have a really, really poor candidate experience. But it really comes down to timely and consistent communication from the point of even before I apply to as far as I get into the process or lack thereof. So the win for companies and as a candidate, but and expectations are much higher these days. I mean, there's been a lot written about candidates who are much more used to the consumer purchasing world of when we buy things online, what they also call the Amazonian effect, where it's a one click, I'm in, I'm out, I'm done. And recruiting really it's come a long way. Automation, I mean, it hasn't really provided that experience. It is much easier to apply for jobs online. That doesn't mean you're ever going to get seen, which is another part of the equation. But that is an area where, the expectations are much higher for candidates. And the defense of every employer that I've ever worked with is that those who have any volume at all of applicants, a good majority of them, unfortunately, are just not going to be qualified enough. We all like to believe that we are qualified for a job. That's why we applied. But at the end of the day, there's only one thing a candidate we all want as job candidates. We want to get hired, and most won't for any given job. But companies control the dials of how they communicate and with what frequency using the recruiting technologies that they have and the human interaction. So they control that frequency and that timeliness. And that's, as a job candidate, what I would be looking for when I'm applying for jobs. Am I are they being responsive? Am I being told what's next? Am I getting definitive closure if I'm not going to be pursued? Those are key things that you should be experiencing as a job candidate.
So you could be part of a large group of people who apply for a position. You get an auto reply because you haven't been selected for an interview. And nobody likes to get that message, but it's better to hear than to not hear. Some people are going to make it to the next stage. In your experience and the research you do at your organization, Kevin, are employers communicating effectively with those people who are getting phone screeners, first interviews, second interviews, or are candidates having a different experience?
Well, it depends. It depends on who you talk to. So, and also, so what we help measure in our benchmark research are the company's ability to do that and what the candidate's perception is of positive or negative experience, as well as their perception of fairness. And when companies, and what we have found in our data and research, that again, when things are happening for candidates, meaning if I'm going to get a phone screen, is everything going as according to plan? Is that happening on the date and time that it said it was originally was scheduled? And I get that phone screen, and then I get a follow-up email right after that saying this is what's next and what you should expect. Those are the things that make a really a whole bunch of difference, and it really does contribute to the perception of fairness, which is subjective for any of us, for that matter. But engagement and communication through every single step is really, really critical. And, for those who and I would argue those who get screened and interviewed at the end of the day, that population of individuals is potentially can have a much more positive and negative reaction to your business and your brand, because that's where there's more investment from you, the employer, and from you, the job candidate, at the end of the day. When you're just applying for jobs online and you get that initial autoresponder, if you are not qualified for that job, that's the end of the road. And that's a good, again, majority of folks. And it's a very limited experience. It's not a great candidate experience. And employers only have so much control over that. And everybody wants feedback, but if you're not qualified, you're not getting feedback. That's just the reality at the end of the day. But for those who are getting screened and interviewed, you better be making that human investment in interaction and making sure that there's definitive feedback and closure.
Well, let's pause here, Kevin. When we come back, I want to talk about what trends you're seeing in the candidate experience. Is it getting better or worse? Because you've been doing this research for more than a decade now. I also want to ask a question I know that's on the mind of listeners. When candidates are having a bad experience, why are employers doing this? So stay with us. When we return, Kevin Grossman, can you talk about what you should expect from an employer as a candidate? Is it time to update your resume? Go to maxlist.org/top resume. The experts at Top Resume will review your resume for free. Go to maxlist.org/top resume. Find out how you can fix your resume yourself or hire Top Resume to do it for you. Go to maxlist.org/top resume. Now, let's get back to the show. We're back in the MaxList studio. I'm talking with Kevin Grossman. He's the president of the Talent Board. It's a nonprofit group that promotes the job candidate experience with benchmarks for accountability, fairness, and business results. And Kevin joins us from Santa Cruz, California. Well, Kevin, before the break, we were talking about what you as a candidate should expect from an employer when you apply for a job. And we talked about examples of bad candidate experience. And you made the point that most employers now are using the auto reply function since the pandemic and helping telling people that if they're not going to move on, that's a fact. And you also made the point about how important it is for employers to maintain effective communication with candidates who've been selected for phone screeners or other forms of interviews. Here's the question I know listeners are wondering: why, when employers don't communicate effectively, particularly with those who've been selected for finalists, do they do this, Kevin? What do employers tell you when you ask them that question?
I get a variety of answers, but they still relate to a very similar theme, and that is that the recruiting teams that are responsible for screening and responding to job candidates at every stage, for that matter, usually are carrying too many requisitions, job requisitions, open jobs that they're screening for, and they don't have a lot of breathing room. It's no excuse for not being more communicative, but it's a reality, unfortunately. And many teams, what we've seen happen with recruiting teams over the past few years is that they've also come and gone. And because of a lot of the latest tech layoffs, for example, a big portion of those individuals, especially in the second waves that have occurred, have been the recruiting teams. And recruiting is something that is the first to go when things take a downturn, and it's one of the first to frenetically come back when there's an upturn. And they have a lot to do when it comes to managing the recruiting and hiring for their respective jobs that they're managing. Not an excuse. And so the highest rated companies in our research every year are definitely making sure that their teams have the breathing room to respond and the recruiting technologies to also help them scale and manage that too, especially for those that have any volume at all whatsoever. So it's usually we've got, especially the past few years, a lot of overworked recruiting teams. They're burnt out. They've seen peers and colleagues be laid off. People have left the industry in recruiting and hiring, and yet I've always argued I think it's one of the most important parts of a business is those who are responsible for sourcing, recruiting, hiring, and retaining people at your companies at the end of the day. So, the companies that participate in our benchmark research every year are leaning in to make improvements. That's why they're participating. They want to learn what their strengths and weaknesses are, and they definitely are making sure that their recruiting team is more responsive. And many of those, the highest rated companies, are also recruiter performance is connected to candidate experience ratings. And part of, and whether it's from being incented or not, that's definitely something that we see with the higher performing companies. Your performance rating is contingent on how you're delivering candidate experience.
Given the importance of talent to a organization's success, how do companies justify not investing in hiring the recruiters they need to provide a good candidate experience? Kevin, why do companies not do that and hire the people they need to do the job well?
Well, that's much more complicated, and it just depends on usually when you're talking about full-time headcounts, bringing on individuals that are full-time employees to help with recruiting or any part of the business. That's where, and especially if you are publicly traded, and even if you're not, even if you're a private organization, that's labor is the biggest part of the bottom line, and individuals and full-time headcounts, CFOs and the heads of finance are monitoring that very, very closely. I think those more progressive HR and talent acquisition leaders are ensuring that they have the right balance of people, process, and technology, and that their team are managing a reasonable number of positions to source and recruit for, and that they also have a really good relationship, even service level agreements in place internally with their hiring managers, because at the end of the day, it's the managers who are usually making the final hiring decisions for these individuals the recruiters are helping to get to the door. And so there's a much better relationship there as well. So there are companies that can and do a much better job at this, but we've also seen a big churn in TA professionals and their teams, leaders and their teams, the past few years too. And it's kind of disheartening to me to find that we've had a few companies that are participating in our benchmark research again this year that have no historical knowledge that they did participate a few years ago and maybe even won one of our awards because they had above average ratings. They have no knowledge of that. So that is the hardest thing, Mac, that we find. The last point on this is that it's one thing to identify these are things we need to do better in recruiting and hiring and improving what it's like for a job candidate. The hardest part for companies is sustaining it over time.
You've been doing this for more than a decade, this research, Kevin. Do you think the candidate experience is getting better overall, staying the same, or getting worse?
Oh, I'm always a glass half full kind of a person. So I believe that incrementally it is just north of staying the same. that's my that's kind of like I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, again, it's there's a really small universe of companies in our data and research that really do this consistently and make a difference for their job candidates over time. And it's not, by the way, it's not that, every single recruiting and hiring professional I've ever known and worked with, 98.9% of them all care about what they do, and they care about the job candidates and wish that you could hire everybody, and they can't at the end of the day. Because unfortunately, for employers, they're in the business of no. They're saying no 99 out of 100 times to people who are knocking on their door to work there. That's the unfortunate reality on average. So there are companies that are definitely doing better. I think it has gotten a tad better, but what we find is that when you have leadership changes in organizations where they for whatever reason that candidate experience isn't a priority for them, then it takes a nosedive.
If you apply for a job and you have a poor candidate experience, and you get an offer, should you go to work for that organization, Kevin, or should you have second thoughts?
Well, so my personal response to that is, I think you should weigh all those things, because it could mean does that mean that that it's going to be a poor employee experience? Is it indicative of that or not? And there is a relationship. There's not always a correlation, but there is a relationship. And we did do a study last year of the 100 best places to work according to Fortune that compared that to the way that we manage and conduct the candidate experience research. And it was kind of a mixed bag because translating poor or good candidate experience to a poor or good employee experience, there is a relationship there though. But here's the thing. If I want to work for a company that is known to have even a toxic environment, whether or not my candidate experience was good or bad, but I really want to work at that company, I'm still going to work at that company if I get an offer. I mean, I don't know how long I might stay there. And I mean, this is, so that comes down to personal preference at the end of the day. But I would definitely weigh my options. If I was really treated poorly and it took weeks and so much time went by and I was waiting and then I finally get an offer and it was just really an inconsistent, I would weigh that before I actually accepted that offer at the end of the day. And we see that happening the past few years. I mean, we have declined offers are up across the board for most companies, most employers, and individuals not even showing up on day one after they've accepted the offer. So there's been a lot of existential crises that we've all gone through the past few years, for sure.
Well, it's been a terrific conversation, Kevin. Now, tell us what's next for you.
So we are in the midst of our latest benchmark research program this year for 2023. So we are excited about that. And I welcome any employer that's listening to participate in the research and get some benchmark feedback from their candidates.
Well, I know listeners can learn more about your organization's work by visiting your website. And that URL is thetalentboard.org.
Correct.
Now, Kevin, given all the great advice you shared today, what's the one thing you want a listener to remember about what you should expect from an employer as a candidate?
I think if at the very least, you should expect a timely acknowledgement of your interest in that company. You should expect consistent communications, and you should get a definitive closure communication if you were not going to be pursued as a job candidate, and that it should all be in a timely fashion. And a nice human touch would be if you actually heard from a human at the end of the day, and that would be even better. That's what you should expect. At a minimum is acknowledgement and closure in a timely way.
Make sure you never miss an episode of Find Your Dream Job. Subscribe to our free podcast newsletter. You'll get information about our guests and transcripts of every show. Go to maxlist.org/newsletters. Again, that's maxlist.org/newsletters. Next week, our guest will be Brandy Oldham. She's a career coach and the founder of Talent Career Coaching. Her company helps individuals, teams, and entrepreneurs in all aspects of the career journey. You have a really bad day at work. It's so bad that you want to quit your job. So you go home and you start sending out your resume. Join us next Wednesday when Brandy Oldham and I talk about why you need to stop sending out angry applications. Until next time, thanks for letting us help you find your dream job. This show is produced by MaxList. Susan Thornton-Hoff schedules our guests and writes our newsletter. Lisa Kislenberry Anderson manages our social media. Our sound engineer is Matt Fiorillo. Ryan Morrison at Podfly Productions edits the show. Don Mole creates our transcripts. And our music is by Freddie Trujillo. This is Mac Pritchard. See you next week.